صراط الذين بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا وعظيمنا وحبيب قلوبنا وشفيع نفوسنا أبي القاسم محمد اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين وأصحابه الغر الميامين. الحمد لله الذي جعلنا من المتمسكين بولاية سيدي ومولاي علي بن أبي طالب. الحمد لله الذي هدانا لهذا وما كنا لنهتدي لولا أن هدانا الله. أما بعد، يقول الله في كتابه الكريم: بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ولقد يسرنا القرآن للذكر فهل من مدكر. The first of our salawat in honor of Rasulullah Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam. The second in honor of Amir al-Mu'mineen Ali ibn Abi Talib. The third with your loudest voices in honor of the Imam of our time, Imam Sahib al-Asr wal-Zaman. There is a request for the brothers at the back to move as close to the front as they can. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. As close to the front as you can. Respected scholars, brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh. The cry yesterday was the cry of anguish. When we examined the verse in which the Holy Prophet speaks about his community, and where he clearly states to his Lord, "Oh my Lord, my people have taken this Quran and have abandoned it." But tonight there is a reply from the Lord back towards the Holy Prophet. The verse in question is a reply of a Lord who loves his creation, but wonders why they do not appreciate the words that he's given them. The Holy Prophet yesterday, it's as if he had placed the Quran in front of his Lord, and he had said, "Ya Rabbi, inna qawmi ittakhadhu hadha al-Qur'ana mahjura." My Lord, my people have taken this Quran and abandoned it. Yet the reply he receives in that courtroom is an interesting reply. The Holy Prophet is a lawyer in that courtroom, and he is accusing people of not taking the Quran in the way they should have. His Lord replies back to him by saying the verse in question, verse 17 of chapter 54. وَلَقَدْ يَسَّرْنَا الْقُرْآنَ لِلذِّكْرِ فَهَلْ مِن مُدَّكِرٍ. We made this book easy to memorize, but are there any memorizers? Without a doubt, these words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ring in our ears very clearly, in the sense that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala looks towards his Prophet and says to him, "You tell me that your people abandoned this Quran. Let me reply to you by saying to you that I made this Quran easy to remember. But are there any memorizers?" Without a doubt, the area of memorization of the Quran is an area of the utmost importance when discussing the Muslim community's abandonment of the Quran, especially in the followers of the school of Ahlul Bayt. If you were to go to many of the communities around the world today and ask the followers of Ahlul Bayt, the ones who believe they are the chosen ones of Allah who heaven awaits, if you were to ask them, how many chapters of the Quran have you memorized? As we know, there are 114 chapters within the Holy Quran. If you were to ask many of the followers of Ahlul Bayt today, within their respective mosques, that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in chapter 54 verse 17 says, "We made this Quran easy to memorize, but are there any memorizers?" If you were to ask the followers of Ahlul Bayt today in 2013, how many of the 114 chapters of the Quran have you memorized? You'll find that many will reply to you by saying not more than 7 or 8. As in, if we were to make the interaction like the interaction we had yesterday, If you were to ask someone in the community today, do you know how to memorize, for example, or have you memorized Surah Al-Kawthar? You'll find most of the community saying, yes, we have. Have you memorized Surah Al-Ikhlas? Most of the community will say, yes. قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدَ اللَّهُ الصَّمَدُ Alhamdulillah, I've memorized. Have you memorized قُلْ أَعُوذُ بِرَبِّ النَّاسِ? Most of the community will put their hand up and say, yes. قُلْ أَعُوذُ بِرَبِّ الْفَلَقِ? Yes. قُلْ يَا أَيُّهَا الْكَافِرُونَ? Yes. أَلَمْ تَرَ كَيْفَ فَعَلَ رَبُّكَ بِأَصْحَابِ الْفِيلِ? Yes. Let's add Surah Al-Fatiha. Yes. Then after that, you start going into a bit of no man's land. You look at the community and you ask them, have you memorized Surah Al-Ghashiyah? It's like, Habibi, I have never read Surah Al-Ghashiyah. You're telling me about memorizing it. You turn to someone, you say to him, have you memorized Surah Al-Nazi'at? I don't know the meaning of Nazi'at, let alone memorize. Have you memorized Surah Naba? All these surahs which I'm talking about are in the 30th Sipara, aren't they? All of them are in Juz'u Amma. Juz'u Amma is the shortest of the chapters you'll find in the Quran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala replies to his prophet's cry of anguish by saying, oh Muhammad, do you think you're the only one who thinks that your community have abandoned the Quran? I look at the people which I made this Quran easy to memorize, and yet many of them have not memorized it. Someone replies by saying, why do I need to memorize the whole book? As in, at the end of the day, all I need is the gist of the book. If I know the book teaches morals and ethics, that's all I need. Yes, for any textbook which you buy from Borders or Waterstones or any bookshop in the world, all you need is the gist. But when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decides to summarize the whole of your existence in 6,500 verses, it's not for you to turn around and say, I've got the gist of the message, I don't need to know. The difference between a book bought on Amazon and a book from the heavens, which is from the Lawh Mahfuz, is that that book comes from the speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Therefore you find that the verse in the Quran which we want to examine tonight was a verse direct from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When his prophet said, Ya Rabbi, inna qawmi ittakhadhu hadha al-Qur'ana mahjura. My people have abandoned this Quran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala replies, oh Muhammad, I made this Quran easy for them to memorize. Yet are there any memorizers? As in, when you look at that verse, how many of us does that verse speak to directly? How many of us on the day of judgment can come to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and say, I have memorized many of the verses of your Quran and I am ready to face you? Can you imagine the school of Ahlul Bayt, how arrogant a school its followers have become? That they'll condemn everyone to hell but themselves, isn't it? As in, if you come to many of our communities, the whole of Islam is going to hell except us. Do you have the audacity to come to your Lord on the day of judgment and respond to this verse by saying, I organized majalis for Imam al-Hussein in Muharram, so can you please open the gates of heaven for me? He'll reply, but I in the Quran, my prophet is sad when you abandoned, and I gave you a book easy to memorize, and you've memorized things which are petty and haven't memorized my book. That's why Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen salawatullah wa salamu alayhi, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa Imam says in a beautiful hadith, recite the Quran and seek assistance from it. For know that the memorizers of the Quran, the fire of hell will never touch them. Understand this point? Imam says, recite the Quran, seek assistance from the Quran, but know that the memorizers of the Quran, the fire of hell shall not touch them. Subhanallah, you know what's so ironic about this verse? How many memorizers of the Quran do we know in the world today? How many of them can you name from the school of Ahlul Bayt? How many? As in, when you go to your car, you listen to Abdul Basit, for example, you listen to Muhammad Sadiq al-Manshawi, you listen to Al-Ghamidi, Al-Afasi, and all of these reciters. You ask the question, what happened to the memorizers in this school? A school which was built on memorizing, a school which was built on pondering, and that's why the Holy Prophet replies with a beautiful line. He says, do not degrade the memorizer of the Quran, because he is under the prophets and the messengers in the heavens on the day of judgment. When you see a person who's a memorizer, hafiz of the Quran, understand that such a person is under the prophets and the messengers on the highest level on the day of judgment. And within the lecture we'll explain to ourselves why. And that's why what is sad is that a few years ago, when that young protege from Iran, Taba'i, the young boy who came to our communities, his mother and his father made it very clear about how their son managed to acquire this memorization of the Quran. All credit, without a doubt, is given to Iran for their emphasis on the memorization competitions and so on. Yet you would think that more in our communities, we would have produced more memorizers of the Quran. That's when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَقَدْ يَسَّرْنَا الْقُرْآنَ لِلذِّكْرِ فَهَلْ مِن مُدَّكِرٍ. We made this Quran easy to remember, but where are the memorizers? Are there any memorizers? His parents laid out a plan. This is what you do with your son. This is what you do with your daughter. From my womb, I would recite the Quran so that my son would be used to the verses of the Quran. Wallah, you ask the question today, the mothers are reciting the Quran from the womb or listening to other things while the baby's in the womb. You find that that mother had made it clear that the be-all and end-all of my life and my husband's life is that on the day of judgment we can stand proud in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when He says, are there any memorizers? We'll put our hand up and say, I didn't just memorize Kawthar and Ikhlas and then feel I'm a big boy in the community. You have in our communities today, people who've recited 7, 8 verses, he walks around like a peacock in the community. Habibi, calm down. You've memorized 7, 8 verses of the Quran out of 6,500. That shouldn't be a sign for you to be proud. That should be a sign for you to hide from the community and then come back one day when you've learnt more. The sadness is a school that was built on knowledge of the Quran has become a school where the focus is more on other things but the Quran. Therefore, tonight in our examination, let's examine the importance of the memorization of the Quran and how we are able to reply to Allah when He says, are there any memorizers? How we can reply by saying, Labbaik, I'm one of the memorizers. Let's dissect this in the following stages. Number one, how important was Arab oral preservation in maintaining the preservation of the Quran with the companions? Number two, how important is it that we understand the prerequisites before we memorize and what things affect our memorizing of the Quran? Number three, what according to the Prophet are the benefits for memorizing the Holy Quran? And how can these benefits even help the parents of a Muslim who originally are disbelievers in the grave? Number four, how did the battalions of the Quran use their memorization to fight Hajjaj bin Yusuf? And in particular, how did Sa'id ibn Jubair use the Quran's memory in order to destroy Hajjaj in his life? Let's dissect this and dissect this topic in complete depth. When you look at the art of memorization of the Quran, you find that originally that memorization of the Quran was an art which every companion wanted to learn. There wasn't a Sahabi of Rasulullah, but that he thrived on memorizing the Quran. If you went to many of the prominent companions, they grew up in an environment where memory was the form of learning. What do we mean? This is a vital theological area in the world of Quran and Hadith. The Arabs used to pride themselves on memorization. Many of the Arabs were not writers. In Arabia, you never had a Harvard or an Oxford or a Yale. In Arabia, what you had was that people would preserve their traditions through memorizing. You would find that many of the Arabs would say that of the most honorable acts in Arabia is memorizing and protecting your traditions. If you were to study many of the original Arabic works in the days of Jahiliyyah, most of them are what? Most of them are works which are taken and preserved orally. The Arabs would say, alongside generosity, alongside honor, one of the most chivalrous acts for an Arab man is their ability to memorize poetry. I remember Jahil, in his famous work, Al-Bayan wa Tabyin, he makes it clear how the Arab man, his honor wasn't in his writing. His honor was in his ability to memorize long lines of poetry without making a single mistake. I remember Ali al-Akbar, of his descendants, Labid, of the descendants from his mother Layla, this person, Labid, had memorized the poetry for the last 30 years of the whole generation. You start a line of poetry, he memorizes it straight away. He doesn't need to see you write it. In other words, they would preserve their literature through memorizing, and even not just their literature and their traditions, they would preserve their genealogies. You know, many times in our communities we ask about our family trees. You'll find that the Arabs, what they used to do, the Arabs used to preserve their family trees not by writing them. they would teach their children orally about their family tree. And then the child would memorize the whole of the family tree. Therefore you had in Arabia, the battles of the Arabs memorized. The poetry of the Arabs memorized. There was no Arab who'd say to you, I'm going to college today to write everything. And that's why this is a vital point when you look at the Quran and when you look at the world of Hadith. Why? Because sometimes people come to us and say, how do you know your Quran is the Quran which was from the time of the Prophet? Because many of your people weren't writing it, they were orally preserving it. We reply, but that was the trait of the Arabs. The Arabs could hear 5 lines of poetry and they memorized them straight away. It's not a negative that the Arab memorized and didn't write. Rather, it's a positive. That was their culture, preservation through oral thought overseen by the Prophet. Even in the world of Hadith, people come and ask us that your books of Hadith, like Sahih al-Bukhari, like Sahih Muslim, all of these works of Hadith that you have currently in the Muslim world, all of these books were books which were written years after Rasulullah. We reply, yes, and what's the problem? They say, well then how do you know that everything's preserved? We reply, look at the culture of the Arabs. Their culture dictated that they preserve everything through memorizing. It wasn't like the Arab was faulty in his memory. No. You give him a piece of poetry, Al-Asma'i in his theory of the Fasih would say, they'd be able to articulate that poetry easily. That meant that the companions of Rasulullah in their younger years would be able to memorize the Quran easily. Why? Because part of their culture was memorizing. You gave him poetry, he memorizes. You give him genealogy, he memorizes. And that's why when the Quran was revealed, the Holy Prophet, what would he do? The Holy Prophet would sit in the house of Arqam. These companions, the early ones, people like Ammar bin Yasir, people like Abdullah bin Mas'ud, people like Zayd bin Thabit, people like Ali ibn Abi Talib, salawatullah wa salamu alayh. You know how they would first memorize the Quran? As if someone was to come and ask you today, how did the Sahaba memorize the Quran in the early days? They'd go secretly to a house. Jibreel would come and reveal the Quran, and we'll discuss Jibreel in Revelation later. He'd come and reveal a verse of the Quran to the Prophet. The Prophet would then sit with the companions. Abdullah bin Mas'ud used to say, the Prophet would recite for us 5 to 10 verses a day. We'd straight away memorize those verses. The companions would sit, they'd memorize those verses, and then when the companions were asked, why were you memorizing these verses? Of what benefit was memorizing the Quran to you? They'd give 2 beautiful answers. Please ponder on these answers. The first benefit for them of memorizing the Quran was to help themselves intrinsically. What do I mean? I mean that when I face many problems in life, I face many stressful situations, I face many moments of anxiety or moments of depression, when I have the Quran stored in my system, the moment I face any difficult situation, the Quran acts as a reminder for me. One of the names of the Quran is what? Adh-Dhikr, isn't it? Adh-Dhikr means what? The Quran means it's a reminder. Whenever you face a difficult moment, the Quran acts as a reminder for you. The companions, what would they say? They say, we'd memorize every word of the Quran. Why? Because we knew that we don't want to miss out on one word. Because any word that comes from the heavens must have a bearing on my soul and on my body. We will not miss a single word. You see, when a verse like إِذَا الشَّمْسُ كُوِّرَتْ وَإِذَا النُّجُومُ انْكَدَرَتْ, some of these companions could say, you know what, all I need is the gist of the surah. No way. Give me every word, give me every pronunciation. I want to know the surah inside out. Why? Because when I face a situation in Mecca where I'm down, I can refer back to the story of Yusuf. If I face a situation where I'm having trouble in my marriage, I can return to the verse about how a husband and a wife should live with each other. Therefore, they memorize firstly because they want the Quran to be part of their system, part of their makeup. The second reason is that so if a non-believer like their parents questioned their beliefs, they could use the Quran as a reply. This is a vital line. Because why? Some of these companions, their parents were what? Some of these companions, their parents were disbelievers. When you've just heard a verse of the Quran, you could either say, oh, that was an interesting verse, I like it. Or you could say, no, I want that verse stored so that one day if I need it with my parents, it may help them, bring them towards the religion of Islam. Look at Ammar bin Yasir. Ammar, his parents Yasir and Sumayya were both disbelievers. Yasir and Sumayya were disbelievers. Ammar didn't tell his parents he had become Muslim. He didn't tell them. Ammar, you know what he did? Ammar would go to see Rasulullah secretly. Rasulullah would receive the revelation. Ammar would hear the revelation. He'd come back home normally. Mom and dad look at him. How are you? How are you? How was your night? My night was good. No discussion. He can't open that the Quran is being discussed. One night when he returns home, as soon as he returns home, his shoulder brushes the idol in the house. When his shoulder brushes the idol in their house falls on the ground and breaks. At this moment when the idol breaks, Yasir looks towards Ammar, Sumayya looks towards Ammar, Sumayya says to Ammar, Ammar, what have you done? He said, what do you mean, mother? She said, you've just killed God. Yes, the idol is dead. So you've just killed God. He said to her mother, if a God can't protect itself from death, how is it going to protect you and my father? At this moment, she looked at Ammar. She said to him, how dare you speak like that to us? Who's taught you to speak like this? At this moment, he looked at her and he said, my mother, I might as well tell you. I've been taught to speak like this by the Holy Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. She looked at him. When she looked at him, she said to him, and what else has Muhammad taught you? The next line that he says is a direct line of memorization at a moment when you need it most. I want to ask everyone in the crowd here, have you ever been in a debate or in a discussion where you need a verse of the Quran but you can't remember it? You're in a debate and the person is trampling you, and I don't need to mention who, but you know there are certain schools, the Quran they've memorized inside out, correct? And he's telling you, prove this to me, and you're like, you know, I heard it in a majlis, which verse was it? When you say which verse was it, you're in no man's land. You're not a soldier that I can look to my right or to my left and say, you know what, come to war with me. Rather, when you have the Quran memorized, Ammar looked at his mom, he said, you want to know what else my Prophet has taught me? She said, yes. He said, we just listened to the verses of the Quran, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, وَإِذَا الْمَوْءُودَةُ سُئِلَتْ بِأَيِّ ذَنْبٍ قُتِلَتْ. The female baby shall ask on the day of judgment, for what reason was I buried alive? His mom begins to cry. Yasir looks at her, he says, Sumayya, what's wrong? And then Ammar looks at his mom. He says to her, Mom, what's wrong? Are you alright? I didn't mean to offend you. At this moment, Yasir looks at Ammar, he says, do not worry. The reason your mom's crying is because before she was born, she had two elder sisters. The two elder sisters were both buried alive by your grandfather. The second one, as she was being buried alive, she touched the beard of your grandfather. Your grandfather was so hurt that he said, I swear, if I have another daughter, I'll never bury her alive. And that other daughter was your mother, Sumayya. Oh Ammar, if Muhammad's Quran from his Lord says that on the day of judgment the female will say, why was I buried alive? Then me and your mother will join the religion of Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. If Ammar bin Yasir at that moment, his mother said something to him and he has no answer, and he says, you know what, let me get back to you, Maulana Sahab, I'm going to call Maulana and he'll give me the ayah. The mother will say, Baba, keep your Maulana to yourself, I have no interest in you or Muhammad's religion. No, because the early Sahaba knew that their Lord has made the Quran easy for them to remember. So go ahead and memorize it. You found that the Sahaba therefore would make it clear that when this Quran is amongst you, don't just read, no, memorize as well. So that when you're in any discussion, you're able to reply. But they mentioned two important points which are vital. Because many of us will say, okay, tonight I'll go home. I'll try and memorize the Quran. Do you know how hard it is to memorize the Quran? Many will turn around and say, you're saying that it's easy, but it's hard. So the companions of Rasulullah teach us something beautiful. They say when you come to memorizing the Quran, there are two key areas. If you can master them, you'll be able to master memorization of the Quran. What are they? The first one is make sure you have a pure niyyah for memorizing the Quran. Vital. Why? Am I memorizing the Quran so that I become famous from memorization? Because there are some, he memorizes. Why? Because he says, you know what? The more I quote Quran, the more famous I can become. And if I can become that famous, then this Quran I'll use as a means for my fame. There are certain people, when it comes to memorization, why? He says, you know what? I'm sitting in this gathering. If I come out with an ayah nobody knows, do you know how big I'll be at the workplace? Do you know how big I'll be amongst my colleagues? None of them know the ayahs that I know. So you found that this person, what's his niyyah? His niyyah in memorizing isn't closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It isn't to unravel the truths of the Quran theologically or metaphysically or cosmologically. Rather, his niyyah is, how can I show off in the community? And I tell you something, I'll be very clear about this. There are many who may have come up and sat on this minbar, but there weren't many who lasted up on this minbar. There are many, they came up and they sat, but then after a while you never heard much about them. Why? Because their niyyah, which may have happened from the time of Kufa and Basra and Yemen, from the time of Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen, they came up, their niyyah wasn't to memorize the Quran to serve mankind, to serve humanity, to bring the Christian and the Jew and the Hindu and the Buddhist all together on one path. Their niyyah was what? That I can become famous from this. If that's your niyyah, then your memorization will not be there for you. Then there's someone else who will say, you know what, my niyyah and memorizing the Quran is what? So I become wealthy. There are some, they know they have a beautiful voice. They say, you know what, let me recite this Quran. I have a stunning voice. Do you know how much I'll be paid if I recite in weddings? Or if I recite in conferences? If a person's niyyah is not pure, then they'll find it hard to memorize. If a person seeking fame or wealth, they'll find it extremely difficult to memorize. The companions of the Prophet would state that if your niyyah is a pure niyyah, then when Allah says, I made this Quran easy to memorize, you'll realize just how easy it is to memorize this Quran. That's number one. Number two, the second point before a person tries to memorize the Quran is that the Quran itself has given you a secret about what to beware of when you're trying to memorize. There's a line in Surah 16 verse 98. It shows you your biggest enemy when you want to memorize the Quran. Who do you think your biggest enemy is when you're just about to memorize the Quran? Shaitan. Without a doubt. As in, you think Shaitan enjoys watching us try to memorize the Quran? But Allah made it clear that Shaitan doesn't enjoy. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. فَإِذَا قَرَأْتَ الْقُرْآنَ فَاسْتَعِذْ بِاللَّهِ مِنَ الشَّيْطَانِ الرَّجِيمِ. Whenever you're about to recite the Quran, O Prophet of God, look who he's addressing, not me and you. He's addressing Rasulullah. That even Shaitan would not leave Rasulullah alone. He never left any Prophet alone. He tries and tries and tries every way to affect the message. In Surah 16 verse 98, Allah tells the Prophet, فَإِذَا قَرَأْتَ الْقُرْآنَ فَاسْتَعِذْ بِاللَّهِ مِنَ الشَّيْطَانِ الرَّجِيمِ. Before you're about to memorize the Quran. Today some of you may say, you know what, Sayyid Ammar? Yesterday you told us that if we recite 100 ayahs of the Quran, we are of the qaniteen, correct? Today I say, let's try and put one surah in your head where you say, this holy month of Ramadan, I'm going to try and memorize this surah. Let me give you an example. Surah Al-Bayyinah. It's only a few verses. But if you ask many of the followers of Ahlul Bayt, have you memorized Surah Al-Bayyinah? How would Surah Al-Bayyinah even begin? You will find that people turn around to you and say, listen, I don't know which surah you're talking about. Bayyinah, Ghashiyah, Nazi'at. When I say these things, I say because all of us have a day where we have to answer the abandoned Quran. If Surah Al-Bayyinah, how many verses? 6, 7, 8 verses? Make a niyyah that I'm going to memorize this. But before you memorize, know one thing. فَإِذَا قَرَأْتَ الْقُرْآنِ فَاسْتَعِذْ بِاللَّهِ مِنَ الشَّيْطَانِ الرَّجِيمِ. Say أَعُوذُ بِاللَّهِ مِنَ الشَّيْطَانِ الرَّجِيمِ just before you start. Why? I'm telling you, every meeting will come up during memorization. Every meeting. Where are you? Listen, we have to meet. Baba, I'm trying to memorize the Quran. Every meeting, every great television program, every invitation for a dinner, every travel you have to go on a journey, when you're trying to memorize the Quran. Why? Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen says it clearly. Shaitan cannot bear someone trying to memorize the Quran. Why? On the first level, it exposes his story. True? And you never want your bad parts out in public, do you? You always want to make sure all the bad points are in private. When someone's memorizing the Quran, they memorize the whole story of Adam, Shaitan and heaven, correct or no? Secondly, Shaitan recognizes that his mission to destroy the Quran, there are people out there who say, no, when Allah said, I made this Quran easy to remember, there are people who are saying to him, Labbaik, years after Adam was there. Therefore, Shaitan, the companions, what would they say? The companions would say, before you try and memorize, and believe me, try this with everything in your memory. Many times people ask me, how do we improve our memory? Wallah, I could say to you, the Imams of Ahlul Bayt have recommended eating almonds, eating honey, reciting the surah. The best of cures, whenever you want to memorize anything, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. Why? ألم أحد إليكم يا بني آدم أن لا تعبدوا الشيطان إنه لكم عدو مبين. He's an open enemy. The Sahaba would say when we try and memorize the Quran, the open enemy for all of us would be shaitan. And that's why you'd find when you look at the traditions of Al Muhammad, I tell you, if you are able to have a pure niyyah and you're able to recite أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم, then the rewards for the memorizers of the Quran are the highest rewards. You know what the Holy Prophet says? The Holy Prophet has a beautiful tradition where he says, the levels in heaven are according to the number of verses you've memorized. So the highest level in heaven is according to the highest memorizer of the Quran, isn't it? When I come and I say that I want to memorize the Quran, even if it's the most basic niyyah that, Ya Allah, I want to be at a good level of Jannah. I don't want to be the level of those on level 7 or 8, although that's still an honor for us. Rather, I want to be with those who are the highest. You find Rasulullah says, in Jannah, the highest are the memorizers of the Quran. But then when they asked Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen and Imam al-Sadiq, they asked them, what's the benefits of the person who memorizes the Quran? Listen to the different benefits which they give. The first benefit, according to Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen, what does he say? The person who memorizes the Quran, everything in existence prays for his forgiveness, even the fish that swim in the sea. Subhanallah. Even the fish that swim in the sea pray for the forgiveness of the memorizer of the Holy Quran. That is a phenomenal line. Firstly, that line shows us يُسَبِّحُ لِلَّهِ مَا فِي السَّمَاوَاتِ وَمَا فِي الْأَرْضِ. Everything in the heavens and everything in the earth, no, everything in the seas is singing the praises of Allah and singing the praises of those who praise Allah. For all we know, there are many acts we may have performed. We say that, Ya Allah, forgive this act, forgive that act. True or no? How do I know that if tomorrow I'm about to pass away, how do I know I've been forgiven? If I try to memorize some verses, even the fish in the sea, Imam says, even they pray for the forgiveness of the one who memorizes the Quran. Furthermore, sixth Imam, what does he say? From his grandfather, what does he say in this beautiful line? A person who memorizes the Quran and recites it looking at it. Yes? Because there are some who recite قُلْ أَعُوذُ بِرَبِّ الْفَلَقِ قُلْ أَعُوذُ بِرَبِّ النَّاسِ, but they won't look at the surah itself. They just recite it from memory. The person who memorizes and recites the Quran, then what happens? Allah lightens the punishment on his parents who have passed away, even if they are disbelievers in Islam. What a merciful Lord who we made a punishable Lord. We made Allah a punishing Lord, didn't we? A Lord of oppression, a Lord of injustice. Tell me which Lord lightens the punishment on people who said you don't exist because their son or daughter memorizes his words. And this is a vital line for our reverts in our Muslim communities today. Do you know in London today and in America, do you know how many reverts sit in our mosques? Many reverts. Do you think it's easy for that revert every time he thinks about his mom and dad or no? Do you think it's easy? Every time that revert thinks about his mom and dad and he hears the truth of Al Muhammad, he wonders to himself, my mom and dad missed out on that truth. My mom and dad didn't die on the love of Abu Abdullah. True? He thinks to himself, or she thinks to herself, that will Allah punish them severely? Rasulullah, Ahl al-Bayt replied, no. A person who endeavors to memorize the Quran, Allah will lighten the punishment on his parents, even if they are disbelievers. Someone turns around and says, hold on, what if his parents are Hindus? What if his parents are, for example, Buddhists? What if his parents are Sikhs? Allah didn't categorize. He said, even if they are disbelievers, if their child memorizes a bit of the Quran, then know that I will lighten their punishment on the Day of Judgment. That Lord doesn't want to send people to hell. That Lord wants to find an avenue for people to come towards heaven. You find that's number two. Number three, this heart becomes rusty, correct? This heart of ours, sometimes you feel very stone-hearted. There is no mercy in you. Arrogance envelopes you. You have no soft words to say to anyone. Your salamu alaykum becomes dry. The Holy Prophet says, the hearts are like iron. They rust. The polish for them is the Holy Quran. Yes? the polish for the heart that becomes rusty. And what do I mean by rusty? Some of us will know inside ourselves when our akhlaq deteriorates with the community, when we start being stubborn, not phoning our family members, you could tell your heart is becoming rusty like iron. The Holy Prophet said, the polish for that rust is memorization of the Holy Quran. Then there's a fourth tradition, which is an unbelievable tradition. And I hope all of us take this tradition on board. The Holy Prophet states that if a person recites and memorizes 100 verses of the Quran, how many? 100. After memorizing them, they say, Ya Allah 7 times. How many times? 7. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will allow them to lift. Even if there is a big rock in front of them, they can lift it in front of them after memorizing 100 verses of the Quran. 100 verses only? That's all it takes. If you pondered over those verses and you did it for me, I'll let you lift that which no one can lift. Go to the day of Khaybar, 7AH. Because you ponder on that day a lot. How do you lift that door? Because you hear the tradition say 40 cannot lift that door. And on top of that, the night before he has an infection in his eye. And he wonders that I'm not able to help my Prophet when my Prophet needs me the most. But the fact was that he was a man infatuated with the Quran, wasn't he? He was a man who had memorized not 100 verses. Thousands were within his soul. In that moment, when he was able to arise on that day in Khaybar, Sa'ad bin Abi Waqqas says something wonderful. He says that morning, the night before, the Prophet said, tomorrow I'll give the banner to a man who loves me and Allah, and me and Allah love him. When he enters a battlefield, he never runs away. Karrar ghayra farrar. He never turns away. That's where his name Karrar comes from, on that day. When on that day, Sa'ad bin Abi Waqqas says, all of us are wondering, who is this man who will be given the banner to fight the opposition on that day? He said, we saw Ali ibn Abi Talib emerge from his tent, take the banner of Rasulullah, and he left all of us. He went alone. Normally, you want your soldiers with you, don't you? But when you've memorized the 100 ayat of the Quran, do you need any soldiers alongside you? He went towards the opposition. You know what, when one Western historian wrote about Ali ibn Abi Talib on the day of Khaybar, Ali ibn Abi Talib on the day of Khaybar was like a demon possessed on the battlefield. He went through the opposition army. When he went through, what was the secret of that day? I'm telling you, if you think about it logically, take logic. There is no way a human being with one hand can lift a door which 40 can't lift. Logically, it's impossible. It's not even a door, it's a fort, isn't it? It's not a door. Yet when they asked him later on, they said to him, how? How did you lift that? He said, قَلَعْتُ بَابَ خَيْبَرٍ لَا بِطَاقَةٍ جِسْمَانِيَّةٍ وَلَكِنْ بِطَاقَةٍ رَوْحَانِيَّةٍ. I lifted the door of Khaybar, not with a strength that is physical, with a strength that was spiritual. If I've dedicated hours of my life to memorize 100 verses of the Quran, after that I say 7 times, Ya Allah, place a big boulder in front of me, I can pick up that boulder and no one can get in my way. Therefore you found tradition after tradition after tradition highlighted that the memorization of the Quran is not just an act, rather it's a spiritual effect on the life of the human being. And that's why the memorizers of the Quran, when you look at them in history, you find that those people would not fear any situation that they faced. Why? Because the moment I know when my Lord says, لَقَدْ يَسَّرْنَا الْقُرْآنَ لِلذِّكْرِ فَهَلْ مِن مُدَّكِرْ. فَهَلْ means, is there any memorizer? When I know I can look at Allah with my face, head held up high, and says, I am of those who've memorized, that means whenever there's any oppression in this world, I don't fear it. No. Whenever there's injustice, I'll be ready to speak out, because I know I've dedicated myself towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If you look after Rasulullah died, the memorizers of the Quran had some phenomenal stands in Islamic history, none like the stand of Kumayl ibn Ziyad, Qambar and Sa'id bin Jubair against Hajjaj bin Yusuf al-Thaqafi. Kumayl and Qambar did not have the honor of being at Karbala. Why? I don't know. And there is no historian in the Shia world who knows. Let me just make this clear. Just before anyone comes and says that we know why. No, nobody knows. Allah knows why Kumail and Qambar did not come to Karbala. That's between them and their Lord. Alongside them, of the great memorizers of the Quran was Sa'id ibn Jubair. Sa'id ibn Jubair was the greatest companion of Imam Zayn al-Abidin. Salawatullah wa salamu alayhi. You know when you've memorized the Quran, you walk around the earth, you're just ready for anyone. And you know when you're ready for anyone, it means that you're not scared of any dictator, no tyrant. Why? Because Allah's words are infused in your soul. Sa'id bin Jubair, Bukhari and Muslim respect him so much that they've narrated more than 200 hadiths from him. In other words, he's not just respected in our school. Bukhari and Muslim, more than 200 narrations are from Sa'id bin Jubair. Shaykh al-Tusi says, one of the greatest companions of our fourth Imam, memorizer of the Quran, from the beginning until the end. In whose time was he living? Hajjaj bin Yusuf al-Thaqafi. Hajjaj bin Yusuf, as we all know, has two famous quotes in Islamic history. The first of them is on Eid al-Adha. He used to ask people, what do people do on Eid al-Adha? And they'd reply to him, people sacrifice sheep. You know, Eid al-Adha, what do people do? They sacrifice sheep. He said, very well, sacrifice anyone called Ali, Hassan or Hussein. Yeah. The second quote Hajjaj used to have is, I wish I was at Karbala so I could have been the one who beheaded Hussein in his last moments. And I tell you, this Hajjaj, there were many Muslims in his time. They'd be scared to stand up against him. Why? A Muslim who only knows this much of the Quran, he doesn't really want to take on battles. But one who knows the Quran inside out is ready to face any dictator. Correct? This Hajjaj would walk one day, he'd walk in the streets. He was the governor of Abdul Malik bin Marwan, the Umayyad Khalifa. Hajjaj would walk in the streets. One day he saw this man. The man didn't recognize him because it was an area which the people had never seen Hajjaj. So he looked at the man, he said to him, hey, come here. So the person came. So what do you think of Hajjaj bin Yusuf al-Thaqafi? So the man said, I hate him. He's a man of injustice. So then Hajjaj looked at him and he said, what do you think of Abdul Malik bin Marwan? He said, he's worse than Hajjaj. So then Hajjaj looked at him and he said, I'm Hajjaj. The person said, I'm from Bani Thor. We have 2 days where we act crazy in the year. This is one of them. Because this person knew there's a sword waiting, so I might as well say our tribe has 2 days where we are crazy. This was the first day, let me off please. Nobody would stand. Nobody would stand. Until Abdurrahman ibn al-Ash'ath, with a group known as the Qurra, the battalion of Quran memorizers. A battalion. An individual battalion called the Battalion of the Quran Memorizers. Of them was Kumail, of them was Qambar, of them was Sa'id bin Jubair. They stood up against Hajjaj. When they stood up, people came to Sa'id bin Jubair, you're 75 years of age. Why don't you just retire? Us Muslims are good at retiring. When there's oppression in the world, you're like, listen, I'm old now. I can't get involved in these things. He replied by saying, a tyrant like him doesn't stay in power while I'm alive. If it means I have to speak out, I have to speak out. Why? Because when they memorize the Quran becomes their walking life. They become embodiments of the Quran on the earth. Hajjaj said, where are the lovers of Abu Turab? He caught Kumail, he killed Kumail, 21 years after Karbala. He caught Qambar, he killed Qambar, 21 years after Karbala. He then caught Sa'id ibn Jubair. When he caught Sa'id ibn Jubair, the conversation that takes place is a phenomenal conversation. Why? Because you'd think you're in front of a man like Hajjaj, you'd give up all your principles, everything you stand for. Wallah, he stood up in front of him with such confidence. Hajjaj looked at him. He said, you're Sa'id ibn Jubair? He said, yes, my name is Sa'id ibn Jubair. He said, no, you are Shaqi bin Qusair. Sa'id means what in English? Happy, isn't it? Shaqi means unhappy. Jubair means unbroken. Qusair means broken. He looked at him, he said, what's your name? He said, Sa'id bin Jubair. He said, no, your name is Shaqi bin Qusair. Sa'id bin Jubair looked at me and said, that's what my mother named me. He said, your mother's wretched and you're wretched like her. A person who hasn't memorized the Quran would reply back with rudeness, correct? No. Quran says, invite to the way of your Lord with wisdom. He looked at him and said, Allah knows about my mother and Allah has knowledge of the unseen. He looked at him at this moment, then he said to him, I've got all this gold and this silver. What do you have? He said, listen, if I thought your gold and silver would save me, I would worship you, not the Lord who gave you all of this. He looked at him. He said, what's your final wish before you die? He looked at him and he said, all I want to do is pray 2 rak'ahs thanking Allah for the gift He gave me of memorizing the Quran. That's it. That I can face Allah on the Day of Judgment and I can say, I am one of the memorizers. I never abandoned your book. I didn't just learn Kawthar and Fatiha and Ikhlas and Nas and Falaq and that's it. I bothered to spend an hour every day to learn the other surahs like Waqi'ah and Yasin and Rahman and Haqqa and Ra'ad and Ibrahim and Bani Israel and Insan. When he was praying the 2 rak'ah, he finished, he wanted to die facing the Kaaba, correct? Isn't that all our wish? So when he wanted to die, he looked towards the Kaaba. He says, وَجَّهْتُ وَجْهِ لِلَّذِي فَطَرَتْ سَمَوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ. Correct? I face my Lord to the originator of the heavens and the earth. His last words were meant to be this from the Quran. Hajjaj said, don't let him face the Kaaba. Humiliate him. Turn him away from the Kaaba. If you turn him away from the Kaaba, you'd think he doesn't have an ayah for the Quran. True? Because if he's facing the Kaaba, he says, وَجَّهْتُ وَجْهِ الَّذِي فَطَرَ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ. When he turned him away, do you know what ayah he came out with? And to the Lord belongs the east and the west. Wow. Wow, wow, wow. You know what Hajjaj did? Hajjaj said, well, if he wants to turn that way, he tried to quote وَجَّهْتُ وَجْهِ, turn him towards the left. He said, and to the Lord belongs the east and the west. So face him to the ground. You'd think it was over, correct? Then he says, from you we created, and to you we will return, and from it we'll raise you again. When you have the Quran, your memory becomes a fortress. You face me the Kaaba, I think of the originator. You face me to the left, to him belongs the east and the west. You face me to the ground, from it he created me, and to it he returns me, and from it he'll raise me alive. 15 days, Hajjaj didn't sleep because of these 3 ayahs. You know what he'd shout in his sleep? He'd shout, what was I doing attacking Sa'id ibn Jubair? He went insane. Hajjaj bin Yusuf, the fortress, went insane. 15 days every night he can't sleep. What did I do? Because he saw the memorizing of the Quran come out in power. A man had principles, he had honor. Wherever he faced, he remembered Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's why, without a doubt, you can have a man lying on the ground and his enemies can all surround him. Yet while he has the Quran memorized, his enemies are in fear. Even if you had many arrows on his body, while he has the Quran memorized, there is no one who can attack him. Even if they came with their shoes and hit his head when he lay on the ground, correct? Even then, you may hear the Quran from his lips. Even when they bring their knives and stab him in his thigh, even then you hear the Quran on his lips. You know what each one of them said when they came to behead Imam al-Hussein on the 10th of Muharram? There was one line all of them repeated, because for a couple of hours he lay on the ground on the 10th of Muharram. And they would come and attack him, but none would dare to behead him. Many tried, but none would dare. Why? They'd say whenever we'd come near his mouth, as we're about to behead him, we'd hear the Quran being recited from his lips. It's as if he wasn't dying. No, it was them who were dying. He was remaining alive. For while the Quran was being recited from his lips, there is no way any of them could have killed him, because his principles could never die. May Allah give patience to Sayyidah Zainab when she saw Shimr sit on his chest on the 10th of Muharram. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. We pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to raise us amongst the memorizers of the Holy Quran. Ya Allah, allow us to be of those who say labbaik to you when you ask, are there any memorizers? Raise us with Muhammad and Al Muhammad. Unite our brothers on the love of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam and on the following of the Quran. We pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala the Surah Al-Fatiha, but before it the loudest of your salawat.